When we discovered in the 60s that the Soviet Union was torturing dissidents by putting them into mental hospitals, the World Psychiatric Association responded by banning any contact with the Soviet psychiatrists or any of their institutions. And that meant everything. It was a complete ban. There was no work on psychoactive drugs together or anything like that. Now we're looking at a very different situation. I mean, something like Pfizer goes into China and tests Chinese citizens who've had transplants, and they're probably carrying around a Falun Gong or a Uyghur organ, or possibly even a House Christian Church organ. This is absolutely should not be defended in any way. And of course, from the academic perspective, they've absolutely not responded at all to this. This should be a blanket ban. That's what we had in the 60s. I'm not saying it worked perfectly. I don't think it really changed Soviet behavior on how many dissidents got thrown into mental hospitals. But at the end of the day, we made a point, and the world made a point. And today we're just looking at a kind of a chaotic situation, I think, on contact with China.
Congressman, or Co-Chair Smith, we've gotten into this habit, ever since. I remember I interviewed you some years ago, and we talked about how this linkage of human rights and trade was broken during the Clinton administration. And, basically ever since that, human rights have been off the table. They've been in these off the books or quiet dialogues, which basically both sides, from what we learned on reporting, viewed cynically subsequently, like they were purely performative, basically. This human rights, it makes no sense, right? Because if you're, as a regime, you're treating your people in a particular way, in this particular egregious way, right? The Chinese Communist Party has treated, hundreds of thousands of its people. How do they view Americans, right? And this feels lost somehow on people. Like we've gotten into this habit of saying, okay, the human rights, you just keep that off the table. Got to keep it quiet. Got to keep it. Of course, I understand that the U.S. government is raising these things in the appropriate venue and so forth, but as Ambassador Brownback has talked about as well, it's their huge Achilles heel, right? They're doing terrible things to their own people, and we should make our own population here in America as aware as possible of that, right? And not sort of play to the kind of platitudes or their propaganda that this is all kind of false and just attacks on China and so forth. So I think human rights is the key.
I was just going to say, Mr. Chairman, I thought you said something earlier that I want to double back to, that for years China's been given a bye on this, and they really have for decades, really until President Trump. He's the first president since Kennedy to actually take them on. Now, today he's saying all these things about Xi Jinping that I'm questioning about, but maybe that's part of the negotiating tactic. I hope it is. It seems like to me that buy is starting to be pulled off, and they're getting not a buy as much anymore, and we need to get to the point where they don't get a buy at all. And I think a key piece of this is just really following the money. As a governor, I saw that our universities in our state, the university heads, their primary concern every morning they got up was money. Money coming into the place, make sure the doors were operating. And I don't begrudge them that. They've got a big institutions to run. They got to make sure we got plenty of money coming in here to run this place. That's what they're thinking about. And so China comes along and says, here, we've got resources that you can use, and this will be, that's why you've got to break these two economies apart. That's why the key piece of this, actually, I think two key pieces. One, breaking the economies apart. And second, us standing up for human rights, particularly religious freedom, because it's such a weakness on their part. This is one of those things, it's kryptonite to them. And they do everything they can to suffocate it and hold it out of the room. When they bring up Taiwan, we should bring up religious freedom. When they bring up any of these issues, we should bring these because this is just something they cannot tolerate. And it's just such an effective tool. And finally, I think we ought to also double back and really press about opening up the great internet firewall that China has. Can you, I mean, this is such the second largest economy in the world, and you got an internet firewall around your people? Come on, that's not leadership, that's suffocation. And we really should embarrass them about it.
You know, very interesting point about the internet. On one of my trips when I could get a visa, I went to an internet cafe. I typed in torture, and I got everything about what the Imperial Japan did vis-a-vis torture, and George Bush at Gitmo, which was false in my opinion, but it was still there. Then I put in Manfred Nowak, and he was mentioned earlier because he did a tremendous job at exposing, on behalf of the UN, the torture there. And nothing, nothing. I put in Tiananmen Square. I got nothing but pretty pictures of people smiling in Tiananmen Square. No tanks, no tank man, no anything. It was really amazing. And so we really have to find our voice more than ever right now. I remember meeting Wei Jingsheng after he was allowed out in 1994. The Chinese Communist Party thought they would get the Olympics 2000 by doing that. They didn't get it. They rearrested him. But while he was out, I was in Beijing. We had dinner together, and he says, please, will you Americans understand this? When you kowtow and you weakly approach the Chinese Communist Party, they beat us more in prison. And he's the father of the democracy wall movement. He suffered almost death at the hands of his torturers. And it's like, we've got to find our voice and stop saying, oh, by the way, human rights. I mean, it doesn't work that way. We have to be so upfront. And this issue of killing people, you know, I read a book before I came to Congress about Unit 731, where Imperial Japan did horrific torture against people, mostly service members, and during World War II in China. And I look at that, then I look at what they're doing now and say, you know, you hated what happened to you, and I do too, but why are you replicating it in very, very large numbers beyond that? So but I would like to ask Mr. Gutman, if you don't mind, walk us through, if you could, or any of you, what a victim goes through. They've already been typed, they're, you know, for their blood type and all the other things, so that a match can be immediately be made. You had said before that there's pretty much an equal male to female, the number of women that are being, average age 28 to 29, being slaughtered, murdered for their organs, as well as males, men, young men. And if you could just, what is this like?
I would, this is perhaps not the answer people want to hear in a way, but it's actually less painful than it used to be, partly because of Dr. Cohen Jha, who pioneered this technique of using ECMO, okay? That meant, originally, what you would have to do is do very light anesthesia, okay, because you don't want to put a sluggish organ into another human being, right? So the anesthesia had to be very light, and it was actually a very painful procedure, according to Nijat, who was a Uyghur who worked with the PSB. Now, when he put in this new technique, it basically meant you could put the person under pretty much full anesthesia, and you'd have the oxygenated organ. It would be kind of running through, so you had constant, kind of in a loop. You go into slow motion, but not that bad. And basically that meant that you could take out the organs in a much more rational way. And you could take them out slower, and you could one after the other, and finally the heart's the last to go. I don't think the person is actually feeling that much. I think we're, you know, if you want, we've made improvements in this area. Now, the problem with that is that we also means that the person who was worth, you could only get an organ or two out of and plausibly get it to the destination. This is something Didi Kirsten-Tatlow from the New York Times worried about a lot. That person is now worth a lot more money, because you can take out maybe up to 5 organs successfully, or 4 organs. Before it was only 1 or 2. Now we're in a very different situation, because you've got like 16 hours, 24 hours to work with this perfusion method. And I'm not saying it's ECMO right now. By the way, I went to Taiwan for 6 months to try to figure this out, and I don't know which perfusion method they are using. I know it started with ECMO. And ECMO. This is an off-label use. For any doctors out there listening, I am not criticizing ECMO. It's a life-saving device. It's fantastic. But this is the way it's been used. And we're looking at a very kind of brave new world situation. I was saying that they don't take organs around the world. That's now possible. I'm not saying they're doing it because I see no actual evidence of that, but it could happen.
But people go there to get the organ, right?
Well, right now, people go to China, but it's increasingly these techniques have led to a different world where it is possible for them to fly out organs, say, to Saudi or somewhere like that, or Russia, or Berlin. This is what we're kind of looking at, and it also means new populations are potentially at risk. I don't want to, we don't see the evidence for this now. As far as I'm concerned, the Chinese are a lot like the old Soviet Union. They like to keep their rocket ships landing right in the country, not in international waters. And that's the way they've been, but.
And just the average cost? I mean, how much do they make, like, for a liver or some other organ?
Well, it depends on who's buying it. Obviously, if it's a foreigner, it's going to be about, $100,000 for a liver these days or something like that, and more like $200,000 for a heart or lungs, where you sometimes get a package deal. Now, if you're Japanese and don't want to negotiate, you might end up paying $1 million. So there's huge differences between, say, Koreans, Japanese, Germans, Americans, and so forth. But we are still talking about huge profits potential on every individual who's this healthy and is done correctly. Thanks.
Co-Chair Smith, I just wanted to comment on the new populations. So one of the things I noticed kind of anecdotally, I'm very sensitive to this dehumanizing rhetoric that's used to target the population first to get the rest of the population to kind of accept horrible things being done. It looked to me anecdotally that there's this uptick of that against Christians in China, and I actually talked with Bob Fu over here on American Thought Leaders on my show about this, and this isn't studied empirically sort of thing, but it really does look like as there's this increased incarceration of Christians with the Zion Church, this restrictions on Catholic clergy and so forth, that there's this increase in dehumanizing rhetoric as well. I would love it if someone would study that empirically, but that's a big concern because that is always this dehumanization is a prequel to inclusion and as a group for forced organ harvesting.
Thank you.